Welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. I really love, I keep talking about how the pandemic has sort of opened us up to how we can use different means to be in conversation with each other. And I'm so grateful that even though we're kind of getting back to normal, we're still maintaining the fact that we can connect across continents. So I'm really excited that we have an opportunity to speak to some of our favorite authors. But I'm with my fave, Dr. A. Hey, Dr. A.
Hey, good evening, everybody. I'm so excited for today's podcast. I know I say this on every single podcast, but it's because I'm genuinely excited. But today I'm extra excited, and I have the supreme pleasure of introducing our guest today, who is Warsan Shire, a Somali-born writer and poet born in Nairobi and raised in London. She's written 2 chapbooks, Teaching My Mother How to Give Birth and Her Blue Body. She was awarded the inaugural Brunel International African Poetry Prize and served as the first Young Poet Laureate of London. She's the youngest member of the Royal Society of Literature and is included in the Penguin Modern Poets series. Shire wrote the poetry for the Peabody Award-winning visual album, Lemonade, and Disney film Black is King in collaboration with Beyonce Knowles Carter. She also wrote the short film Brave Girl Rising, highlighting the voices and faces of Somali girls in Africa's largest refugee camp. Warsan lives in Los Angeles with her husband and 2 children. Bless the Daughter Raised by a Voice in Her Head is her first full collection. And she is our guest today on the Cheeky Natives. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you guys for having me so much. I'm so excited.
Can we talk about the titles of your books, right? So I keep thinking about teaching my mother how to give birth, right? And thinking about Bless the Daughter Raised by a Voice in Her Head. And just how the chapbook and this first time full poetry collection are in conversation with each other. But I'm interested in titles and how titles tell a story. So I wanted to speak a little bit about those particular 2 titles, but what titles mean to you.
Yeah. Well, I've always loved long titles. I remember coming across a collection of short stories in a bookshop, and the title was No One Belongs Here More Than You. And it was a collection of short stories by Miranda July. And I'd never heard of her until that moment, and my mind blew open. But I've always loved long titles. I remember even a film that I just went blind into watching because I liked the title, and it was called A Guide to Recognizing Your Saints. And I feel like titles can be like a poem within itself, like a small snapshot. Well, sometimes I do go for just a simple title, but sometimes I feel like the introduction, it's almost like it's the name of the poem. And the longer it is, sometimes the more of a story that there is. But I'm drawn to that kind of stuff anyway.
I wanted to speak a little bit about how the book opens. So I think of extreme girlhood, and I think of the quotes by Ntosi Kishanga that everybody likes, and I feel like has almost become weaponized. To be Black, woman, and alive is a metaphysical condition I haven't quite yet conquered, right? And everybody's like, yes, Black girl, you can do it, except that sometimes you really can't. And for me, I think to be Black, woman, and alive is to exist in a constant state of precarity. And maybe that is the metaphysical state of being, right? Is to be in this constant state of precarity. But there is a statement that you make by opening with that poem that I'm really interested in, just in continuation with the title. But I wanted us to speak about why you chose to particularly open with that in this collection of poems.
Well, actually, at first I was playing around with the title for the full collection to be Extreme Girlhood. And actually, I ran it past one person who happened to be a white colleague, and she said, "Oh, like girls in the hood." I was like, "Oh no, no, that is kind of, but wasn't what I was going for, and actually hadn't thought of at all. Even though I'm a big fan of the film Boys in the Hood, that wasn't what I was thinking of at all. And so I did also, so actually that links into entirely how a lot of our childhoods we're not allowed to have. We're not allowed to experience. Adultified from such an early age, over-sexualized, given too much responsibility, parentified, and also like vilified and made to be much more scary. Never allowed that innocence or that purity, because a lot of Black children aren't allowed to exist as Black children. And we have so many examples of that are like devastating constantly. So for me, speaking specifically about extreme girlhood, poetry for me was always a means to understand what was going on around me and to understand myself. And so very early on, it dawned on me that it was, for some reason, or in my particular family, kind of a wicked thing to be a girl, to be born a girl child, and also a thing of disappointment. And there was a frivolity that was connected to what it meant to be girl. And for me, growing up, also just not fitting specific beauty ideals, and also I ended up just genuinely resisting them as well. And so for me, this book is almost like a loop. The last poem and the first poem, it's almost like the endless cycle of just being a girl and what that means. But for me, I am hoping to highlight that we can be triumphant, and that we can be rebellious, and that we can be very strong, and that there is power in the transformative nature of being able to explore your trauma and then make something good of it and share it with others so that they're able to do the same. And hopefully making us better people, I hope.
I love that you've spoken about emphasizing girlhood, right? Because I feel like for Black girls, that's something we're often denied. So you go from birth and the disappointment for many people around having a daughter and what that means for progeny, etc. And then you are meant to just be this adult who earns their place in the home. So you have to be super responsible. You must be the eldest African daughter, and there are all of these responsibilities, and then you move to being somebody's wife. And there is no space for you to ever explore what it means to just be a girl, to be frivolous, to be a child. There's no space for that. And I love that we're having this discussion around like girlhood. What does it mean to be a Black girl, right? Without being tired or whatever is thought of. There's just so much, just like you are just not allowed to just be like, you must be tired from working, right? And constantly doing the labor, be it physical or emotional. Anyway, I could go on about this because, wow. I just wanted to speak a little bit about the idea of while we're talking about titles, is to speak about how some of your poems are interestingly titled, and the repetition of bless, right? So we think of I think of blessings like I'm blessing you, almost as like a benediction, as a prayer, as this. And you then use blessing in a very interesting context. And I'm interested in that because I'm thinking of the poem where you bless the Kumai, and I had to look, I may be pronouncing it wrong, but I was okay, Warsan is blessing the Kumai, let's go. While we speak on titles, I just wanted to think around why there is the repetition of blessing and why you've used the acts of blessing in such a particular, almost contradictory way.
Well, yeah, I definitely had the very intentional thought of blessing the unblessed, or the ones that are usually left out of blessings, or cursed specifically for the simple act of living. And for me, poetry was always a way of being able to take it all back, take back your memories and interrogate them from another perspective and transform it into something else and make yourself the hero in your own story. Just what your imagination is able to do for you in the act of storytelling can be actually quite merciful and quite healing. And so it was really important for me I forgot what your question was, and I started talking about random. Am I still on the same thread?
No, you are. You really are. You're talking about like how you're thinking about unblessing and
unblessing. Yes, that's it. Sorry. No, because it's something I think about a lot. I think about this idea of like suffering in vain. And when people know of your suffering, then in some way you're considered a martyr or a saint. But for all those that go, and I think one of the most important poems in the book for me personally is a poem for Victoria and Ilian. And I think that's a perfect example of somebody who was forgotten and was neglected and was abandoned and overlooked, specifically because she was a young Black girl, and specifically because it just wasn't, no one cared. And so for me to, okay, so to me, Victoria symbolizes what happens when everyone looks the other way and children are put in harm's way. But this is the most evil, most depraved version of it. And still that we forget. And it happens all the time, over and over and over again. There'll be a documentary here, and there'll be a documentary there, but nothing ever really truly changes. And we don't actually care about our children as a society worldwide. They just keep continuously being the most abused and the most, but I don't want to get into a long tirade. I think we're all against child abuse in this conversation right now. So for me, it was really important to constantly come back to this idea of thinking of her in heaven, thinking of her surrounded by mothers and completely in bliss and experiencing euphoria and ecstasy, and taking something that was so horrific and giving her another way to exist without ignoring everything that she went through, and giving everybody who reads the poem an opportunity to also bless her and to read about it and to honor her. And she's memorialized. So that was important for me, and I hope I can do more of that.
I'm interested in the last stanza of two poems because I think they're like quite interesting. So the first is Extreme Girlhood, right? Where you say, Mama, I made it out of your home alive, raised by the voices in my head, right? Which connects quite beautifully to the title of the poem, right? But then you also think about Bless the Ugly Child, right? And we think about like, honestly, like beauty standards are really weird. And like how like, for some of us, when we think about beauty standards, you think about like you've grown up being the ugly child, and then all of a sudden, suddenly in your adulthood, everyone is like, oh my gosh, you're so beautiful. But because you've been socialized to believe that you are not fit the ideal standards, you're not able to accept that you are beautiful. But the last stanza of Bless You Be Your Ugly Daughter, you say about God doesn't she wear the world well, right? And it's so interesting to think about that, right? Like just like how socialization, I made it out because of the voices raised in my head, and but God doesn't she wear the world well? That in many instances, it's like even the beauty standards, as you grow older, it's like it's this idea of like wearing the world well, but also thinking like there's some instances in which you had to remother yourself, right? So I think about like the teaching my mother how to give birth. And just in many instances, you had to be the one that said to yourself, or as many girl children do, it's just like, okay, I have a complex relationship with this maternal figure, but I gotta hold up. So I'm interested to think about that, right? The idea of like mother-daughter relationships, because I think a lot of your work explores that, and I'm interested to find out your thoughts about like these complex relationship between mothers and daughters, because often people don't want to delve deeper into what they mean for the socialization of women of young girls who become women, and how that impacts their relationship with the world.
I think it's very taboo across many cultures to say anything of that's even remotely unflattering about your mother. She's supposed to be the saint. She's supposed to be perfect. And growing up Muslim, Islam teaches you that after God, it's your mother. As a child, I always wondered though, because I always saw examples of wicked mothers. Like I actually would see clear examples of child abuse as a child and think, well, I think there are some people out here that don't really love their children. So what does that mean? And so what does that rejection coming from a mother figure, what does that do to a child? And so what does that do to the psyche, and what kind of adult does it create? So naturally, this leads me to serial killings. And I realized that most of these serial killers delving into their childhood, like honestly, majority of them despise their mothers. Something truly awful either happened from their mother, or they just felt like kind of cast away. And so it's really interesting what the mother wound, as it's called, is able to do to people. And I think it's something that's overlooked because it's too common. Everyone has a mother. Okay, some people, mothers, they never get to meet. Some people's mothers pass away, and some people's mothers sell them. So it's like it runs the gamut of every Mother's Day. There are lots of people who have very, very complicated feelings when that day comes around, because not everybody has a simple relationship. For me, I always was very aware of the fact that my mother didn't really have much of a maternal bond with her children. But then as I grew older, I started to think about the fact that, she didn't really have much of a choice in family planning. If she had, maybe she would have chosen to be child free, which is completely fine. But because she was forced into that situation on some level, and we are all forced into this planet once we are thrusted out of our mothers, we don't have a choice but to just get on with it. And so for me, the way I cope, because I have a deep respect, admiration, and love affair really with my mother. I am in awe of her because she's first of all, so beautiful. I know that's kind of vapid and shallow to be referencing, but when from a young age you see your mother as somebody on the TV, I didn't have to I still did, but I didn't have to continuously go outside of the home to see what beauty meant. She was a representation of almost movie star beauty. But along with that came the feeling of insignificance in comparison, and also having to live up to this high femme ideal of femininity and beauty. But also that leads into what you were mentioning about feeling ugly. And what it means. I grew up with different, I grew up type 4 in a household full of type 2 to type 3. So it was I was adopted, and I felt that I had to be really militant about it, because it seemed to be the only thing that made me genuinely visibly Black. And so it made me politically who I am too. So I'm so thankful for that feeling of being outcast or the Black sheep, and not fitting certain ideals, including growing up being a fat child my whole entire life, and what that means, and the kind of comments that you hear. And I remember with my cousins who were dark skinned, and then they would be constantly mocked for it from another family member who was the same skin color as them. And so I would just remember just really being aware of the fact that not only were our bonds as girls being eroded between the comparison that was forced upon each other to meet beauty ideals, but also just how unfair it was. They would I would sometimes just remember me and my cousins just being in a room and just crying about how ugly we were. Kind of ridiculous, but it wasn't really about the way you looked, it was about the way you felt. After a while, you keep being told something and it actually affects you. So for me right now, as an adult, I do have body dysmorphia and I do have eating disorders, and that's a direct result of that feeling ugly. So it truly doesn't matter if you eventually look the way you've always wanted to look, or if a million people tell you you're beautiful, or you even start to think, oh, I'm kind of cute. It's the way you feel inside, and it's that child version of you that's forever messed up, that I'm working through in the poems. And I actually have come quite far, so I think it's working.
So speaking about that coming from, thinking of the poem Filial Cannibalism, just in thinking of this theme around mothers. And I'm just going to read a little bit from it. And so it says, from time to time, mothers in the wild devour their young, an appetite born out of pure bright need. Occasionally, mothers from ordinary homes, much like our own, feed on the viscid shame their daughters are forced to secrete from glands formed in the favor of men. And Lotlakonolo is having a Yubikani. This is the audio version of snapping your fingers. But I feel I have an alternative take on the conversation, and that's just because I feel like, having watched your poetry evolve, because I'm a Tumblr girl, so I'm exposing my age. I'm a Warsan Shire Tumblr girl from back in the day. So those who know what I'm talking about. But there's an evolution in the way in which I think you write about your mother that speaks a lot about the ways in which we see you develop an empathy and an understanding, right? And I think that so much of that is also born from experiencing particular things in your life, right? So be it experiencing motherhood, and then making sense of the things that happen as a mother. There is a particular sense of empathy that we see develop in your writing. And interestingly enough, I found that this poem was an example of that, which for me is just, filial cannibalism, motherhood, cool. And I wanted to speak about the ways in which poetry has been a way to make sense of the things that happen to you, but also of why the people in your life are the way that they are.
Exactly. I think it was, that's all it really ever was. And so I was the eldest, and home a lot, just looking after the kids. And it was just me and my imagination to get up stuff and to find, to forge a way forward. And it was really, really fun. But the biggest thing that giving birth gave me is complete empathy and understanding, but also completely take me back to being that child and feeling myself completely the opposite of how my mother felt. So having to mother my sisters and mother my brother and mother myself instilled in me from a very, very young age, massive maternal instinct, which I'm so grateful for now that I am a mother. But the moment I felt that, and the moment I held my child, I realized that my mother never felt that. And so it was both understanding that and also grieving that, feeling fully what it could have been. So it was both completely eye-opening, but then with everything that I was realizing, it was some of the most painful times as well, because I could feel this bond with this child that I knew my mother just didn't have with any of her children. And it is what it is. We never get to really truly discuss it because it's taboo. Mothers and women are judged much harsher. It's almost as if it goes back to this thing about Eve. If a mother was to reject her child or not feel it. I mean, it was the second I had a child, I realized, what if my mom just had postpartum depression that just went unchecked, and she's just never, like, I have so much privilege compared to her, and she afforded that to me. She lived that life so that I could have all this access and to find the language for what she struggled with, and to make sure I also don't struggle with it. So it was a gift. And so all of it ultimately comes back to love. So that's forgiveness. And it can only come through really truly interrogating what happened to her when she was a child, what happened to the people that raised her, what was society like, understand like what is going on. It's not just about you. Like, it seems like most of the people on planet Earth have terrible childhoods. And then so therefore that's why planet Earth is pretty terrible. So and it also links back to what I was saying earlier about children. So it, people spend their whole lives in therapy trying to figure out what happened. What happened was, it was shit. It was terrible, and it made you feel crap about yourself. So what we're going to do now, I decided to do poetry. Everybody can find something and we can genuinely make other people feel better. And hopefully the children will then grow up a little bit happier and then Earth will get less ghetto. So yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to.
And then Earth will get less ghetto. May I ask you to read the last stanza of Midnight in the Foreign Food Aisle?
Absolutely.
This may be Little Honolo's favorite poem in the whole book. I just want to put it
Perhaps you should read the whole poem. Like, I just think we had...
No problem. Man, I feel so honored. Thank you for asking me. All right, so I'll dedicate this to you then. All right. Midnight in the Foreign Food Aisle. Dear uncle, everything you love foreign, or are you foreign to everything you love? We're all animals and the body wants what it wants. Trust me, I know. The blonde said, come in, love, take off your coat. What do you want to drink? Love is not haram, but after years of fucking women who are unable to pronounce your name, you find yourself totally alone in the foreign food aisle, beside the turmeric and saffron, remembering your mother's warm, dark hands, prostrating in front of the halal meat, praying in a language you haven't used in years.
Listen, this poem destroyed me.
Oh.
I think it destroyed me because it I think there's a lot of grief that takes place in the book in a really literal sense, right? We think about grief as in someone may have passed away and we're grieving. But I think what Midnight in the Foreign Food Aisle does, it speaks about a different type of grief, and a grief that I think your work has done a lot exploration of, right? So the grief of statehood, right? And the grief of like namehood, right? And the grief of like just community and family and like home, you know, and this for me was like, oh my gosh, like what a mind to just pack so much of grief in one poem, right? So you think about like after years of fucking women who are unable to pronounce your name, right? And how important it is for us as Black people, particularly, to have our names pronounced properly, right? And you find yourself totally alone in a foreign food aisle. So you also speak about that separation, the grief of home, of being a refugee in another country, right? And you speak about the praying in a language you haven't used in years. So even the grief of language. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? So just the exploration of the various types of grief that you do in the book, but more importantly about like statelessness and what it does for human connection.
Oh man. Yeah. It's I was always so my dad was a journalist, right? And so he was a very hardworking, very successful journalist, specifically focused on like corruption across Africa. And when the war broke out in Somalia, he was still selling the newspaper, and he was selling it underground. And there were times that it was being sold by refugees in different countries across the Gulf and other parts of Africa for like $100 per like one newspaper. And so he was really thriving and had like a rich future ahead of him, worked really, really hard, grew up pastoral, like grew up herding camels, and got himself through to university, went to Russia, studied all of the random places, experienced all kinds of wild things to finally make a life for himself, and then everything for it to fall apart. So being raised by somebody who knows so much, but then also is experiencing being invisibilized in real time, and that's your father. And the life of being a refugee in Europe, in the UK, in the 90s was one where you were lucky to get away with dignity or to have any integrity. It was trying, everything was going to beat it out of. So he's raised us up, me and my brother, he raised us. This is before my mum and dad broke up. I was around 7 when they divorced. But before that, so for the first 7 years of my life, I grew up in a house. And actually, after they split, she still kept it on the walls. But what he'd done is print out these massive photos of Mogadishu pre and post-war, side by side, like massive, massive frames. And me and my brother would get these lectures every single day about exactly where he came from and exactly what happened and what happens to society and to families when war breaks out, and like really specific, almost inappropriate details. And I think that's where my morbid fascination came from, but also this nostalgia and connection to home that I never experienced because I grew up in London. So I think he really rooted me in knowing that I was from somewhere else and in that place didn't truly exist because you couldn't go there. And when you'd see it on the news, or you'd see it in an advertisement about, donate some money for starving children. And so that was the only examples that you had. So he started showing me photos of wedding photographs and VHS. And then so I started becoming really interested in the 70s Somalia and early 80s. But anyway, I digress.
The poem about Grace Jones is my favorite poem in the book, but this is one of my favorite poems, and this is The Unbearable Weight of Staying.
Unbearable weight of staying. Yeah. I read it and I was like, what? Are we okay? Are we okay? No.
The kids are not okay. The kids are not okay. Okay, the kids are not okay.
Unbearable weight of staying. I don't know when love became elusive. My mother's laughter in the dark room. What I know is that no one I knew had it. My father's arms around my mother's neck. A door halfway open. Fruits too ripe to eat.
Yo, somebody snap their fingers at home when you listen to this podcast. So I'm gonna have a little bit of a moment, and I feel like a lot of the poems in this book are coming full circle, and a return, but a leaving or something. And I say that because I think of the poem that she wrote that was like, sure, that's what I'm saying, like the Tumblr girls know what I'm talking about. You are a horse running alone. And at the end you say you are terrifying and strange. I can't paraphrase this poem because this poem is amazing. But it says you are a horse running alone and he tries to tame you, compares you to an impossible highway, to a burning house. Says you are blinding him that he could never leave you, forget you, wants anything but you. You dizzy him, you're unbearable. Every woman before or after you is doused in his name. And at the end, the last stanza says, you can't make homes out of human beings. Somebody should have already told you that. And if he wants to leave, then let him leave. You are terrifying and strange and beautiful, something not everyone knows how to love. And when I read The Unbearable Weight of Staying, I almost thought of that woman. And I almost thought of I thought about the way in which she writes about desire. And she writes about women who are constantly desired but not loved all the way through, and what it means to be a woman who exists in that chasm, right, between the desire and the love all the way through, and what it means to stay in that space. And so I wanted us to talk a little bit about why you write about those kind of women and why you write about desire in the way that you do. That line about the elusiveness of love is a fear for so many of a particular kind of woman, right? A woman who is too much, who is a lot, right? Because we always get referred to as being a lot. Like, oh, she's a lot, she's just too much. But there is a chasm, and there's a kind of woman who exists in that chasm that she writes about. And I wanted us to speak a little bit about that.
First of all, I deeply relate with the unhinged woman. I grew up raised by a lot of what I would describe as unhinged women, whether it was they were unhinged because they were genuinely mentally ill, or if it was just because they simply had dared to follow their dreams, or they had some kind of style, or maybe they went on dates occasionally. It was like I just really was interested in these really rich secret lives of women that were in many ways, because they were so invisible, people also constantly overlooked them. And so if I think about why people care about people more when they're good looking, is because we are able to assign humanity to those that we're raised by these ridiculous romantic comedies. And so if you don't see yourself in that, you think that you are capable of being loved, or if you are even deserving of it? What does it look like? I mean, I am now, how long have I been married for? Wow, that sounds terrible. I can't remember, maybe like 7 years or something like that now, yeah. But listen, for a long time, I still had my mother's voice in my head that was like, listen, like, you're just unruly. Like, you need to get, like, you're disobedient and you talk too much, and you think you're a lawyer, and it's not gonna turn out well for you, basically. But I just want everybody to know it does, because you'll find somebody who will love you for who you are. But I think my first true introduction to like this idea of Black love and Black romance in a really beautiful way was the film Love Jones. And when I first watched that, it really completely created for me what was possible. And so Black love to me then was like completely perpetually linked to like jazz and to poetry. And so my idea of romanticism is completely wrapped up in that. So coming from a refugee background and coming from Muslim family where, sexuality and all of this is also very taboo and stigmatized, what was never lost on me is how like the women around me were still so enchanting and seductive in a natural way. And so in some ways I wanted to just highlight our natural as Black women, our beauty, which is usually shown in either really crass ways or oversimplified ways. And I wanted to show that also, it's not that I even want to show these things, it's just that I'm interested in the complexity of what it means, and this like virgin whore complex, and just like what it means for a woman to want and need, and also the difficult relationship with men and patriarchy and being raised by women with internalized misogyny, and all these boys that they raised, and how to love them, if to love them, and then it's very complicated.
I kind of want Bless Grace Jones to be like our closing, like as in we're done and Grace has been done. But what I was really interested in is wanting to know, what do you hope the book will do? Now that it's out in the world, what do you hope that it will do? Because I think the book does so many things, and often, after writers have written, they're like, oh, now the book is in the world and it can do what it needs to do. But I wonder if you have any hopes for what your first collection of full poetry will do.
Yes, I have this really clear image of when I was just 13 years old, and I'd go to my local library and I would be looking for a book that made me feel like a real human being, like reflected me on any level. And every time I would find that, and I would over and over again, because there are so many, amazing writers. But I remember the first time I came across Edwige Danticat, her collection of short stories. She's a Haitian writer called her Crick Crack. She wrote those collection of short stories when she was 22 years old. And I remember being drawn to the book simply because her brown face with braids up to her neck, I just saw her like bright eyes, and I just felt, oh my God, I need to read this. This is somebody that I feel like looks even remotely like me. And I read that book and it exploded my brain and it changed the trajectory of my life. What I hope for is that, there are people that will find themselves drawn to this book and find themselves feeling less alone, maybe a little bit comforted, maybe feel a little bit more understood, and perhaps feel inspired to follow their dreams because we come from similar backgrounds or from this growing up with this perspective that possibly the future is not that bright. I hope that it can make you feel like maybe you want to write a book, and I'd love to read it. Yeah.
I mean, so, I've been thinking a lot about how we write ourselves into being. And I think that a lot of the work that your book does is an excavation, so this book is I'm okay. So I'm interested in poetry as a means to uncover what has been forgotten or what we don't think about. And I think so much of this book is that excavation. It's about your childhood, and it's about like what you need. It's about an act of remembering, I guess. This is what I'm trying to say. And I think there's something so deeply profound about excavating your childhood, right? Because it also means that there are things that you may have forgotten about as a way for your brain to protect you that you then remember. And I want to know, what is the self-care work that you do in doing this kind of work, right? So how do you, having excavated and found some really painful memories sometimes, or some painful remembering, how do you then come back to take care of adult you in remembering childhood you?
It's something that I have had to constantly do and will have to do for the rest of my life, which is like, even just yesterday, I got really upset with myself for having a strong reaction. Like, I get anxious very quickly. And when I get anxious, then I start telling myself like, oh my God, you're so pathetic for being anxious. And so I had to just stop myself and be like, I was like, okay, I know it feels a little bit cheesy, okay, but we're going to have a little discussion with ourselves. I was like, would you say this to your baby self? No, because I would never speak to my children like that. Never, ever. I wouldn't speak to anybody like that. I only say it for myself. So I had to say, like, just come back to myself and be like, do I hate myself? No, I don't. So I need to speak to myself a little bit more gentle. And then I calmed down and I listened to a little bit of music and I chilled out. And it was like nothing happened. Usually that could like really devolve into some bullshit. So speaking to that child self, which is really important. I would recommend that for everybody because it will make you be kinder to yourself. And I think when you're kinder to yourself, there's more possibility for you to actually change what it is that you want to change.
I mean, that's deeply profound, right? Because I've been like on this quest of like, oh, I'm learning to be kinder to myself. I remember going to therapy and saying to my therapist, like, I'm here because I just want to give my child an opportunity to live, like to actually live, right? And part of that is like really reparenting myself and knowing that like I'm not responsible for the things that happened to me when I was younger, but I know that they're impacting me now, and in a way to make future me happy, present me needs to do a lot of the work, right? So I was like nodding when you're saying that because I was like, yeah, you're right. Like I've never spoken to anyone the way that I speak to myself, right? And so I kind of need to remember like, okay, come on, be more gentle and be more kinder to yourself. But I wanted to say thank you. I think that this has been a really wonderful conversation, but more importantly, like I think that your work, I mean, from Tumblr days, because we're like those Tumblr girls, has been really like holding us quite close. But I think this collection of poetry will do what exactly you wanted to do. I felt seen in ways that I haven't experienced statelessness in that sense, right? But like being queer, you kind of like are always an outsider, right? So you're like grieving a childhood that you could have had if people just loved you for who you are. So in that instances, like this otherness, this grief, like allowed me to like sit with it in more ways. So thank you so much for that. And I really hope that people pick up this book, and when they do pick it up, that they find that they sit with it in the way that you want them to sit with it. So really, really thank you so much for being in conversation with us, but also for writing this beautiful collection of poetry.
Thank you so much.
Definitely. So thank you so much, Warsan. I mean, to echo what Letlokonolo has said, for me, I think the beautiful thing about your writing is how so many of us feel seen in the work that you do. And for people who look like myself and Letlokonolo, there's something so profound about somebody thinking that you are so important, that you need to be seen in their writing, and you need to be seen, and you need to be seen by the world. And it's not something that we get to experience often. And so it's not lost on us how important this work is. And so thank you so much. The work is profound, and we are so grateful that it's out in the world, and we can't wait to see what it does for people who look like us and who feel the way that we do. And so I think we can only close this wonderful conversation with an ode to another Black girl who's made us feel seen, who set the scene for what it means to just be yourself incredibly and loudly at a time when it must have been so incredibly difficult to be. And so there's no better way to close off than with Bless Grace Jones.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for making me feel so comfortable. Your questions so thoughtful, and it was really meaningful. I really appreciated speaking to somebody who understands what it is that I'm writing about and who has had lived experience. Very meaningful, and thank you. Also, I feel very lucky to be able to see your cute faces. This is only for me. Only for me. Okay, so bless Grace Jones. Bless Grace Jones, Holy Mother of those deemed intimidating, patron saint of the unapproachable, savior of those told to soften their expression. Our Lady of Uncomfortable Silences, Dame Grace Jones, your daughters damn their insomnia, turn in their dreamless sleep a legion of women flinching at touch. Fortify them, monarch of the last word, darling of the dark arched brow, we bless you, Queen of the Katai. We lay our burdens at your feet, careful not to weigh you down. From you, we are learning to put ourselves first. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cheeky Natives. Please go out and get yourself a copy of this wonderful collection of poetry. Like, no, don't ask for a PDF. Like, really, like, go out and buy yourself this wonderful collection of poetry. And just, walk into a store, your favorite bookstore. If they don't have, just be like, listen, I'm here for my girl Warsan, and I really want to get a copy of this book because I've got other copies of the book, but I really want this one. So please, again, one last time for the people at the back, please go out and get Bless the Daughter Raised by a Voice in Her Head by Warsan. And from the Cheeky Natives, we say, until next time, goodbye.